in the midst of this part of the process. So let us pray. Loving God, we ask that you would open our hearts, our eyes, our ears, and our minds to the work of preparation that you have laid out before us. I ask that you would calm our spirits, and that the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts would be pleasing to you. Amen. So we've been talking a lot about joy already. And I want you guys, if you feel comfortable, to close your eyes for a moment. What comes to mind when you hear the word joy? Just shout it out.
Seeing others happy.
Seeing others happy.
My children.
Your children.
Church.
Babies.
Light.
Church. Light.
Love.
Sunrise.
Love. Sunrise. Music.
Nature.
These are all good things.
Health.
Health. It's another good one. Connection. Service. Great. Art. For me, when I close my eyes and think of joy, I am a teenager again on my parents' little boat that we had out on the lake, splashing around in the water with my friends, feeling the sun on my face, and getting out to have a snack and then jumping right back into the water again. That is where, that's what I think of when I hear the word joy. It's just this childlike innocence and playing in the water. I wasn't worried about bills or homework or anything, just worried about maybe getting a sunburn. That was the biggest concern that I had. And it was a great way to connect with nature and with my family and with my friends. And that's what I think of. And I always felt this great sense of anticipation. When I knew that we were going to be going to the lake, I would just get so excited. And anticipation is a word that we'll be hearing a lot over the next few weeks of Advent. Advent means to prepare, and the sense of anticipation as we get ready for Jesus' birth, which is not that far away. I don't know how it's December 1st, but we have this chance now to really prepare our hearts and our minds for the coming of Christ on Christmas. The passage that you heard Rich read this morning, the first one comes from the book of Isaiah. It comes from chapter 2, so it's pretty early. This section of the book of Isaiah was thought to be written 800 years before Christ. It's a long time. And in this particular section of Isaiah is describing a vision that he has, where he imagines seeing all of these people coming together and hearing the word of the Lord, and they take their weapons, they take their swords and their spears, and they beat them into plowshares and pruning tools. So they take these weapons and they turn them into agricultural tools, means of growing fruit and vegetables and grain. They turn them into means of growing food and providing food to sustain a community. And in the midst of this, it says that God will bring peace among the nations, and that nations will not be at war with one another, but will be at peace. This doesn't mean that there aren't conflicts anymore, but it means that they aren't settled by means of violence. Because the weapons have been changed from means of destruction to means of growth and helping a community sustain itself, where there's no war or violence. How many of you like the sound of that? How many of you think that sounds like a pipe dream that could never be a reality? It's okay, you can be honest. It sounds amazing. This idea that no one would be harmed by war or violence anymore. Where weapons like AK-47s could be turned into gardening equipment. The activist Shane Claiborne, who I've quoted before, actually did that. He lives in an intentional community with people in the city of Philadelphia, And they took some automatic rifles, and through means of blacksmithing, they melted them down and were able to use the metal from the rifles to make equipment to sustain the garden that feeds the community that they live in. It's a pretty powerful image. Sometimes it can be hard for us, I think, to think about what does beating a sword into a plowshare, what does that look like in today's society? But to think of these automatic rifles that can cause so much damage being melted down and used for something good that can sustain life, it's a very beautiful thing. And I think as Christians and as people of faith, we live in this sense of anticipation and hope that this kind of world could come about, even though it sounds so far out of our reach. We have to live, I like to think we have to live in a sense of hope that this could come about because we are told and promised that God will bring about heaven on earth. That's what we have to live for, right? Because it's so easy right now to be discouraged by the division and separation and angst and tension that exists in our world. The violence, the inequality, the oppression, all of that weighs so heavy on the heart. So how is it possible that this dream of peace could become a reality? Well, in the text from Romans that Rich read for us, it talks about the Apostle Paul is writing to the church in Rome. He has never gone and actually met these people. He's writing to them because Rome was such a seat of power, and this church existed that not only had new Christians, but it had Jewish Christians who had heard about Jesus, and so there was this tension of people coming from the Jewish tradition and people who were Gentiles coming and becoming a Christian, and they were trying to figure out how to work together. And there was a lot of tension about that. And Paul is writing to them, and he says, wake up. You can't stay in this state of slumber. As I mentioned a few weeks ago, the early church was convinced that Christ was going to be coming back that very day. So they were just waiting. And Paul says, you can't just wait. You can't just be like someone in bed sleeping, not paying attention to what God is doing, but you have to get up. He talks about Christ's coming again and how they were in this state, and we are still in this state of kind of waiting and anticipation of Christ to come. It's like waiting for the sun to rise. He describes it as being in this space between nighttime and daytime, this kind of dawn experience. How many of you are morning people and like to get up and see the sunrise? That's awesome. I am not one of those people. So more sunrise for you to see. But Paul talks about how the church is kind of living in this in-between phase. And he encourages the people of Rome to not live as people of the night, to not do behaviors that tend to happen at night, but to wake up in this pre-dawn phase and to be ready for when Christ comes, to get out of bed and to put on Christ. As they go into the world, they're supposed to spread this message of love that Christ taught, that blessed are the meek, blessed are the poor, love your neighbor as yourself, clothe the naked, feed the hungry, visit the sick, visit the imprisoned. That's what it looks like to put on Christ, to wake up and to encounter people right where they are in their lives. That is how we help bring about the image of weapons being beaten into gardening tools, is when we wake up and we put on Christ. That image that Isaiah gave us is not possible if we are idle, or if we act like that expectation and that hope doesn't exist. If we say, oh, that's never going to happen, then it won't. We have to wake up every day and be ready to try and bring about a little bit of peace right where we are. Even if it just looks like reaching out to that family member that you don't really get along with, maybe you're not very excited to see over the holiday season, or friend or coworker, or even in your own self. If you see something you don't like, reaching out and trying to have honest conversation. Again, this image of Isaiah where there is peace doesn't mean there's not conflict, but it means there's compromise, there's conversation, and there's grace. Where do you need some of those things in your own life? My family is amazing. I grew up in Western Pennsylvania where the culture is very, very, very different than it is in California. And my family sees the world a bit differently than I do, in some ways. They're all amazing people who strive to follow God, and they serve others, and they go out of their way to do good. But we see the world differently. But that doesn't mean we can't be in relationship with one another. We still love and support one another. My mom texted me at 2 a.m. Pennsylvania time last night to say, I'm praying for you, I'm thinking about you for tomorrow. This is what you're called to do. Remember that. She was up in the middle of the night worried about me being worried. Because she loves me. Even though we might not agree on everything, we can be in relationship and we can support one another. Even when it's hard, we love each other enough to have those conversations. It's not always easy, but it's so worth it. And I encourage all of you to reach out to those people who you disagree with, even when it's hard, and try and have conversations that are open. Because when we tear down the borders of otherness that separate us, that is when the image of peace can come about. That is how we turn the swords of our words into words of plowshares that can help nurture and grow a loving relationship.
Amen.
So I encourage all of you, as we are working on this sense of bringing joy to the world, today the lyric that we were thinking about is to prepare him room. As we anxiously await the coming of Christ, and as we live in a sense of expectation of the hope that peace is possible, have joy. I don't think it's possible to have joy without hope. And I also don't think it's necessarily possible to have hope without joy. They go hand in hand, and they're fruits of the Spirit. When we live a life that we get up and we put on Christ, these things will naturally be cultivated in our lives. Instead of weapons of war, we have weapons of growth. They're not even weapons at all. They're tools that help us nurture our own spirits and the spirits of others. So let us live with this joyful hope that God will bring about this image of peace in heaven right here. And the most beautiful thing about it is that we get to be a part of it.